Hello, my beautiful fellow space blobs. We are here again, continuing to figure out this life, how strange it is to exist, and hopefully to find some grace and some beauty, some deeper poetry in that whole process of exploring and living this life. I know I need reminders of this all the time, and I'm hoping today's chat will be so helpful for anybody who is moving into their first Saturn return, their second, their third Saturn return, maybe wants to understand Saturn a little bit better. And stick around to the end of this video because we are going to be talking about Saturn squares and oppositions as well, which I think are so interesting and important if you are also moving through that. So this is just going to be such a foundational, I think, soothing, relaxing, and empowering conversation. It's a conversation I wish I had had access to when I was beginning my journey, in my late teens and early 20s as I was exploring myself and studying. I think conversations around Saturn have been longing to be revitalized and refreshed and explored in new ways. And so I think this conversation is just going to be so soothing for anybody who's needing a little bit of a breath as they move through life cycles. So let's just get right into it. All right, Saturn returns. These are such a notorious transit, and I think there's a reason for that. I think so many people get into astrology actually because of Saturn returns. There's something about it that is just so alluring and mysterious and feels really true. And I think that's because we live in a culture, just like the general large mass media culture, that has so little ritual in it. We're all longing to understand the evolution of our being through life. And I think Saturn returns do a really, really good job of acknowledging crucial, huge life transitions because they happen every 29 years or thereabouts. So the first one happens when we're between the ages of 27 and 31, somewhere in there for a couple of years. It won't be the whole 4 years normally. It will be somewhere in there around when you're 28, 29, 30. You'll have another one in your late 50s. That's your second Saturn return. And for those of us with nice, long, robust lives, there's a third Saturn return. So these happen around every 29 years. And I think that's so interesting, right? Because they happen at these key places where we are grappling with who we are, how we live in this world, and how we're changing shape. I think the first Saturn return is exceptionally notorious, right? Because it comes at a time when we are still figuring out who we are. We're very young. We're leaving behind childhood, adolescence, who we were as our brains and bodies are developing, as all of the messaging for the world came in, as who we might have been in a family system, who we were trying to be to please authorities or to stay safe in the world. And we're coming into a new era of life where we're having to figure out who we are beyond all of that, how we're having to figure out how to live in this life and be true to ourselves. And now we're also grappling with what it means to be an adult, right? And I think this is also an interesting phase because our culture likes to, at least I grew up in the US, so we have some special stories, but one of the kind of innate stories that we're often told, when we're in elementary, middle, and high school is that, when you get to around 30, there's this thing that'll happen where you won't have to ask any more questions. You'll pay your mortgage, you'll go to your job, and you'll just be good. And I think when we get to that first Saturn return, it's a realization that, oh no, the questions just get deeper. The themes just get deeper. And figuring out who we are becomes a lot more layered and complex. Nobody warned me about this. And so I think that first Saturn return is very tender in coming into our own as a person. And that's a big reason why I think a lot of people, when they're entering that first Saturn return, really want to know more and understand what that process is going to be. But I think it also acknowledges some of the heartache that comes from leaving behind a version of ourselves and the confusion that comes with starting a new cycle. Second Saturn return is so beautiful. I think whenever I talk to somebody who's worked with their second Saturn return or is working with their second Saturn return, the wisdom and the viewpoints they bring are so, so valuable. some of the most valuable. And that phase of life is about coming into a great mastery. There's starting to be an understanding of what really matters in life and how we can employ that in this next phase of life. And it really brings us into deeper communion with what's really, really true. But it's also leaving behind all the worries and fears of middle age, which is a very intense time with a lot of questioning and heavy themes as well. And there's also a release, and I think even maybe a celebration in leaving behind some of those questions and challenges and bringing in the wisdom. And then, of course, the third Saturn return is often known for its ability to see the whole process of life and understand that entire arc from a really beautiful perspective. So if we just think about Saturn, what are the themes? What are the energies there? Saturn is known as Father of Time, Lord of Karma, and also often associated with themes around discipline, maturity, and obviously another big theme is restriction, this whole idea of restriction. Now, here's where it gets interesting for me. I think all of those things I just mentioned, Father Time, restriction, discipline, are actually neutral ideas. They're not loaded with emotional weight. However, our culture is very into this idea of like a punishing God. And I think Saturn has fit very tidily into that box that a lot of us were raised with. Not everybody, but a lot of us. It's kind of intrinsic there, right? That there's this punishing father figure that will get you for not being responsible enough. And so a lot of us, I think, when we think about contending with Saturn in any meaningful way with a return or opposition, whatever, are going to be thinking in terms of, okay, well, I'm about to get told how I've failed, how I've done poorly, how I haven't taken enough responsibility, or I haven't had enough self-discipline, and therefore I deserve X, Y, and Z. And this is the problem, I think, in general, that I see often in the astrological world when we're approaching any question that comes with Saturn. We need to take all that off the board. Saturn is about how we care and tend for our lives over time. The process of doing all those little things, just living through a day. How do we respect ourselves? How do we show up? What does that look like? How do we want that to feel? How have we changed? How do we have to acknowledge that our shape has changed completely? These are more the questions that I think are helpful when working with Saturn. Saturn's about how we show up in the day-to-day and how we treat ourselves and others, and how sometimes when we think we want the whole world and we want to have everything on our plate and to gorge ourselves, what we're really longing for, and this is that idea of restriction, is to be able to feast on something that really nourishes us rather than just having a giant platter of meaningless things. So one of the reframes I want to put out there right away with this whole idea of Saturn return is that often we'll enter Saturn return or a thought about Saturn in any placement that might feel tender, that what have I been doing wrong and how will I be punished for it and corrected for it? I think a lot of times we'll enter into these spaces thinking that's how it's going to be. But I like these questions instead. What am I longing for help with? That one just makes me feel like I can breathe right away. What am I longing for help with? Perhaps, you're confused about how to enter this next stage of life, or how to discover who you are, or how to let go of a phase. Where do we need help? Where do we need somebody to hold us and help us and feel that we are cared for? Another question is, what am I longing to be able to express and unfurl from within my spirit? What do I need help expressing? What do I need help starting to birth into the world? Because Saturn is also about how we birth things into the world, how we take them from an idea into something that we live and experience through time and place. So where do we long for help? Maybe in a big, overwhelming longing for a new chapter of life to contain, a deep partnership, a meaningful home, a meaningful creative endeavor, whatever those longings might be. And also, what is longing for expression? And as I step from one form into another, where do I need help in learning how to express and move through those things? And these are really the questions. It goes back to that theme I was talking about, in that our culture has so little ritual in it. And this is one place where I think we can all, you hear the phrase Saturn return, and it's like you kind of get it. You get that it's about this innate thing that happens in life where suddenly we have to start asking new questions and contend with who we are becoming. And there's kind of this sense of relief when we realize, like, I just need help learning how to unfurl this new thing, learning how to let go of my old form. I need help to see clearly so that I can take care of myself, so that I can be sure to be there for the important moments, where I can be sure to set those boundaries if need be, where I can be sure to speak my mind and hold my ground where need be, where I can be sure that I am cared for from the inside out. And I think this also, Saturn returns have a lot to do with inner parenting and how that mechanism is working for us. And I think that first Saturn return is really interesting because so many of us come from family systems. Even the best intentioned of people in the world, we're all flawed, and we all have, different stories and themes. So even the most beautiful parents in the world, I love you all, can have, given their children different ideas or thoughts. And I think Saturn return is also a wonderful opportunity to think about how we want to parent ourselves moving forward, not just based on who we were when we were children or who we were when we were parents in middle age, also for that second Saturn return, who we're becoming beyond parenthood. So this is also a really wonderful time for that. So Saturn returns are notorious, right? Like, we hear them talked about as a time where everything gets stripped away from you, everything gets blown away, and you have to just start again. But here are the things that I would keep in mind. If you're about to move through a Saturn return, or you've just moved through a Saturn return, like I mentioned, this is an initiation into a new stage of life. So it's about letting go of our hard clinging on to maybe who we were in one stage, but it's also about the curiosity and openness that comes when we allow ourselves to change naturally. I think another important aspect of Saturn return is acknowledging the mastery of certain skills. And now that we have those skills, we're being asked to move on to the next set of skills. So we may have learned how to be really good students in university, or to do really good at a certain job, or even to play a certain role in a relationship or a dynamic. But now it's time to move forward into the next dynamic. And there's an acknowledgement here in this process of doing both of those things, acknowledging the skills we've mastered and accepting that we are starting to begin a new set of skills. I think also this is just a season of, whenever we're working with a Saturn return, acknowledging the process, that things take time to come into full perspective. And this is also a time of deep, profound perspective, where we are able to take in the much larger process that we have been working with. And like I mentioned as well, this is just, I think, such a relief to acknowledge that we are going through these transitions and that we aren't holding the same shape anymore when we move through a Saturn return. So those are some of the ways that I would start to explore your Saturn return. It's going to be your own. It's going to be completely yours. I know that mine was definitely powerful. It was a really, really deep time in my life. And mine came through in very specific ways. I did a lot of learning through a relationship, which I think many of us do at that time. I did a lot of learning through work as well, and location. And I had to ask some really deep questions of myself. But I definitely came out the other side much more capable of moving into my next chapter of life. And actually, right after my Saturn return, I started sitting down here to chat with you all, just probably a couple of years afterwards. So it's been a really rewarding time since that first Saturn return. So I just wanted to take a moment before we close out today. I feel like we could talk about this for like 2 hours. Just a moment to acknowledge Saturn squares and Saturn oppositions, because I think many of us, maybe we aren't going through our Saturn return right this second, but we might have, like for example, I have a lot of energy in Leo. I have a Leo sun, Mars, Mercury. So Saturn, when it was in Aquarius, was doing a nice long opposition to all of that energy over in Leo for me. So I definitely know what an opposition feels like at this point. Or you might have a square. For example, right now, Saturn in Pisces is squaring my rising sign in Sagittarius. So these are both opportunities to work with Saturn, to explore Saturn. And similarly to the Saturn returns, these are places for kind of reassessment and acknowledgement of our changing selves. So let's start with squares. And squares can happen with any placement, any insignificant placement. Like if you have a sun in Sagittarius, sun in Gemini, you're going to be experiencing Saturn square with Saturn in Pisces. So some Saturn square themes. Saturn is squaring off against beliefs and routines that are no longer serving you. So this is a really great time to just think about, where you might have gotten into a repetitive loop about thinking over the last few years. It's not always about a lifetime of habitual thinking. It can also just be about breaking up maybe some of the routines we've gotten into over the last few years, acknowledging that old patterns cannot survive if we want to live a joyful life. So, if you're like wanting to begin that new project or wanting to be really present in your life now, but it just feels like kind of flavorless and tasteless because you're just still feeling like attached to some old life dreams, this is a really great opportunity to just acknowledge that in order to be able to taste life in the present moment, sometimes we have to let go of the old. Being willing to make pivots and start new projects. And knowing that we're not going to know how it works out, but that we're going to have to do the vulnerable thing and begin. I think that's a very big thing with Saturn squares. Also, Saturn squares ask for us to look at places where we are afraid of insecurity. This world feels very insecure. Like, I think most of us struggle with worries around having shelter, having food, being able to, keep ourselves and our loved ones alive, I think that's such a universal fear. And this is a really great opportunity to look at some of those fears and work with them and give them some compassion and grace, but also tell a story that helps build your sense of security and knowing you can handle things as they come. And also with the square, deep honesty in what feeds your soul. So those are some of the themes that if you have right now as I film this, and this chat can go for any year, any time. You could be watching this in 2025, and this will still be a useful, valuable chat. But if for right now in 2023, if you happen to have Sag or Gemini energy, you'll be working with some Saturn squaring because it's going to be in Pisces for a while. Now, Saturn opposition for those with any Virgo energy this year, this will sit with you. But once again, this can apply throughout the years for anybody in the opposing sign. So Saturn opposition, similar to the squares, we're having a chance to look at our lives from a new perspective, right? I feel like whenever there's an opposition, it's like being able to have this ability to look at our lives from outside of it and to see it with like this fresh view. So reevaluation of our life, what do we really desire? What really brings us life? Maybe the way we've defined ourselves, defined what makes us who we are and what makes us valuable, is time for it to kind of change form a little bit and start to take on new aspects. I think also Saturn oppositions are really spiritual. So it's like a complete overhaul, a rededication maybe, or a remotivation to find a way to feel connected to spirit and to the acceptance of our process, that we have a process, that each of us has an innate rhythm that we need to work with rather than trying to constantly fight against. And that's something that I think is so beautiful and valuable. Having just had my Saturn opposition when Saturn was in Aquarius, I can definitely say that I felt that deeply. I think this is also similar to the square. The Saturn opposition is an initiation into new projects, new relationships, new ideas. Not all of those, but some of them, depending on who you are. There's an initiation into it's time to begin something new, even though you're scared. And it's also an acknowledgement of things ending. So an acknowledgement at the end of projects or relationships or other things in life. And I forgot to mention too, Saturn could also, the Saturn currently happening, like Saturn and Pisces, you could also have like a Saturn in Sag or a Saturn in Gemini, and that could also be a Saturn squaring your natal Saturn. There's a lot of ways Saturn could square or oppose you or be conjunct with you with Saturn returns. So that gets very technical, and I don't want to confuse people more, but I hope that this was helpful. It was pretty impromptu. I just could not get this topic out of my head last night. So I sat down and wrote up some of my thoughts about it. Let me know if you have more questions about Saturn, though. I'm happy to continue the conversation and do chats throughout the year, check in as we're moving through Saturn and Pisces. I am going to be having some really great group calls over on Patreon if you would like to join me. We do these community calls every couple of weeks. We have 2 every single month. They're amazing. We get to chat with each other. We get to work out some ideas together. We get to journal together. I would love to see you over on Patreon. It's also what keeps me going here in this space. You can also find me on Instagram and on my website, and I would love it if you liked and subscribed because it makes the world of difference. You have no idea. So thank you so much for being here. I will see you again very soon, my fellow space blobs. Have a beautiful time, and maybe try and find friendship with Saturn. What do you like about Saturn the most? Talk to you soon.